Welcome back to Becoming Black Scholarly, conversations about identity, scholarship, and becoming. I'm your host, Fred, and if this is your first time joining us, welcome. Becoming Black Scholarly is a growing community for Black, first generation, and non traditional scholars exploring identity, scholarship, and becoming. Before we get started, I want to offer a brief disclaimer. This space is built for Black scholars, dreamers, and learners. What I share comes from my experience and research, but your journey is your own. Take what supports you and keep building your path with intention. Now that that's out of the way, I want to go ahead and go over some housekeeping real quick. So, if you remember from the first episode, I was talking to you guys about my process, and I want to continue to be transparent in that. So, I was sharing in the first episode how I had just finished my bachelor's degree this past May, and one thing I was waiting on is for my degree to be conferred. Since I've recorded the first two episodes, my degree has been conferred and it has been shipped. However, it was shipped to my previous address, and I've already dealt with the university on that, and they have a new degree coming to me. It should have been in the mail today. So I will be getting that in a few weeks, and you can watch me unbox it on my social media. And if you're watching the video recording of this podcast, the next recording after it arrives, I'll unbox it on there. So that is that. I also want to share that I did start my master's program on July 7th. So today I'm recording this podcast late. So this was supposed to be up last Friday. Today is Monday the 20th. So today is the end of the second week of my master's program, and tomorrow starts the third week. And I have 3 more weeks after that. So a total of 4 more weeks left in this first class. So it is rocking along. So let's go ahead and get into today's episode. Over the past few weeks, I have found myself thinking about something I hadn't really considered before. Today, we have access to something previous generations of scholars never had before. And I don't think we talk enough about how significant that really is. 20 or 30 years ago, if you wanted to understand what doctoral education looked like, your opportunities were much more limited. Maybe you knew someone pursuing a doctorate. Maybe you had a professor who was willing to share their experience. Maybe you read a book that offered a glimpse behind the curtain. But for many people, especially Black, first generation, and non-traditional students, that window simply didn't exist. Doctoral education often felt like something happening behind closed doors. You knew the destination existed. You just couldn't see much of the journey. Today, that's beginning to change. You can watch dissertation proposal defenses on YouTube. You can watch final dissertation defenses. You can hear doctoral students talk openly about imposter syndrome, burnout, research, writing, and everything in between. You can listen to scholars reflect on their journeys while they're still living them. In many ways, we can see the destination long before we ever arrive there. And I think that's a beautiful thing. It removes some of the mystery. It makes the journey feel a little more accessible. It reminds us that scholars are people, not just titles or degrees. But the more I sat with the thought, the more another question kept coming back to me. Just because we can see the destination, does that mean we're preparing the right way to get there? The more I thought about the question, the more I realized something. Watching someone defend a dissertation isn't the same as understanding everything that made that moment possible. We can watch the final defense. We can celebrate the hooding ceremony. We can applaud the accomplishment, but we don't always see the quiet years that come before it. The mornings when reading felt difficult, the evenings spent wrestling with ideas, the moments of self-doubt, the moments of breakthrough, the ordinary days that slowly shape the extraordinary outcome. Most of all, we don't always see the becoming. And maybe that's because becoming isn't always visible while it's happening. Sometimes it's only when we look back that we realize how much we've changed. I think when most people start to think about doctoral education, the conversation immediately turns to applications. Which school should I apply to? How do I pay for it? How do I find an advisor? How competitive is admissions? Those are important questions. We're going to spend plenty of time talking about them throughout this podcast. But lately, I've become convinced that there's an even more important question we need to ask first. Who are you before the acceptance letter ever arrives? The more I've asked myself that question, the more I realize that we spend a tremendous amount of time preparing for our applications, but very little time preparing ourselves. We polish our personal statements, we update our resumes, we compare universities, we research tuitions, we think about recommendation letters, worry about GPA, worry about deadlines, and all those things matter. But somewhere in the middle of all that preparation, I wonder how often we stop to ask, who am I becoming while I'm preparing for all of this? Because eventually the application gets submitted. Eventually a decision arrives. Eventually classes begin. But long after all of those milestones have passed, you still have to live with the person you're becoming. I don't think enrollment creates a scholar. I think enrollment simply makes visible a process of becoming that has often been unfolding quietly for years. The real journey starts much earlier. Looking back now, I don't think I realized it was happening. I thought I was preparing for another degree. What was actually happening was that I was beginning to see myself differently. I wasn't reading just to complete assignments anymore. I was reading because I genuinely wanted to understand. I wasn't writing because someone told me to. I was writing because I had questions I wanted to explore. Somewhere along the way, curiosity became stronger than simply trying to get the right answer. And what's interesting is that no one assigned that transformation to me. There wasn't a class called Becoming a Scholar. There wasn't a checklist that told me I had reached some invisible milestones. It happened quietly, one book at a time, one paper at a time, one conversation at a time, one question at a time. Looking back, I can see the transformation much more clearly than I could while I was living it. And I wonder if that's true for many of us. Maybe becoming is something we usually recognize in hindsight. In episode 1, we talked about becoming as identity work. In episode 2, we explored the question, who are you becoming? We reflected on the quiet transformation that often takes place long before anyone else notices it. As I started outlining today's conversation, I realized there's another question that naturally follows. What happens when the identity you've been developing finally walks into the institution? Does a university give you your identity as a scholar, or does your identity shape how you experience that university? The more I reflected on that question, the more I've become convinced that belonging doesn't begin on the first day of orientation. Belonging begins long before enrollment. And that's what today's conversation is about. Today's episode is called Becoming Before Belonging: Why Identity Matters Before Enrollment. My hope is that by the end of this episode, you'll begin to see that the strongest foundation you can build for a doctoral journey isn't your resume, your GPA, or even your application. It's your identity. Because belonging isn't something a doctoral program gives you, it's something you carry with you. Let's begin. When I first started thinking about doctoral education, I assumed my biggest question would be practical ones. Which school should I attend? What program makes the most sense? How much will it cost? Can I balance work, family, and school? Will I even be accepted? Those are all good questions. In fact, they're necessary questions. But over time, I realized they weren't my first questions. They were my second questions. My first questions was one I didn't even know I needed to ask. Who am I becoming before I even submit an application? The more I reflected on that question, the more convinced I become that it changes everything. Because if we never stop to think about who we're becoming, it's very easy to spend years preparing for a degree without ever preparing for the person who will earn it. And I don't think those are the same thing. When we hear the word identity, we often think about labels. We think about race, profession, education, gender, the titles people give us, or maybe the titles we're working towards. Those things certainly become part of our identity, but I don't think they're the foundation of it. Identity goes much deeper than a label. Identity is a collection of beliefs that shape how we move through the world. It's the story you believe about yourself when no one else is watching. It's the values you refuse to compromise. It's the habits you're intentionally trying to build. It's the way you respond to criticism. It's how you define success. It's the questions that keep you curious long after everyone else has moved on to something else. It's the reason certain problems capture your attention while others don't. It's the lens through which you interpret the world around you. Long before someone calls you doctor, already begun developing a scholarly identity. You may not have had a name for it. I know I didn't. Looking back, I can see that it wasn't another degree that changed me. It wasn't a better GPA. It wasn't making the dean's list. It wasn't the way I started approaching learning itself. At some point, I stopped asking, what do I need to know to pass this class? And I started asking, why does this work the way that it does? What assumptions are we making? What are we missing? Whose voices aren't being heard? How can this be better? Those are different kinds of questions. They're questions that don't disappear when the assignment is submitted. They stay with you. They show up while you're driving to work. They interrupt your thoughts while you're reading a book. They surface in conversations with friends. They follow you into documentaries, podcasts, journal entries, and everyday life. Eventually, curiosity stops being something you do. It becomes part of who you are. And I think that's one of the first signs that you're becoming a scholar. Not because you suddenly know more than anyone else, but because you're starting to look at the world differently. You begin to see patterns, you notice assumptions, you become comfortable sitting with questions that don't have immediate answers. You stop chasing information simply to accumulate knowledge. Instead, you begin pursuing understanding. And I think there's a difference. Information answers questions. Understanding teaches you how to ask better ones. That's the kind of shift I'm talking about. I don't think scholars are defined by the degrees they earn. I think they're defined by the questions they continue to ask. The degrees recognize the work, but it doesn't create the person doing the work. That's the important distinction. Because if your identity depended entirely on being accepted into a doctoral program, what happens when the application is denied? What happens when you receive difficult feedback from a professor? What happens when your research doesn't go the way you expected? What happens when you struggle through a semester and begin questioning whether you're capable? If your identity begins with acceptance, then every setback has a powerful. If your identity begins with acceptance, then every setback has the power to make you question who you are. But if your identity has already taken shape before you ever apply, those moments don't erase who you are. They simply become a part of your growth. The rejection still hurts. The criticism still stings. The difficult semester is still difficult. But none of these experiences have the authority to define your worth. That's why I believe becoming comes before belonging. Acceptance letters matters, degrees matters, titles matters. You should celebrate every one of those milestones, but none of them should be responsible for telling you who you are. They should simply affirm the work that's already been happening beneath the surface. And for Black scholars, I believe that distinction becomes even more important because many of us have spent our lives navigating spaces where our value was questioned before our voice was ever heard, spaces where we felt pressure to prove ourselves before we were trusted, spaces where we sometimes wonder if we belong at all. If we allow institutions to define our identity, we also give those institutions the power to define our worth. I don't think that's what scholarship is supposed to do. I think scholarship should deepen our understanding of ourselves, not replace it. It should strengthen our voice, not erase it. It should sharpen our thinking without asking you to abandon the experiences that shaped your thinking in the first place. Because once your identity is rooted in who you're becoming, you can begin asking a very difficult question. Not do I belong here, but what kind of scholar am I called to become? And I think those are two different types of journeys. One of the biggest surprises in this journey has been realizing that identity doesn't just answer the question, who am I? It quietly answers 100 other questions before you ever realize you're asking them. It shapes what captures your attention. It shapes the problems you feel compelled to solve. it shapes the conversations you keep coming back to, and eventually it shapes the kind of scholar you're becoming. As I started looking more seriously at doctoral education, I assumed choosing a program would mostly come down to practical consideration: ranking, tuition, flexibility, faculty, program length, location. Those things matter. I'm not suggesting they don't. They're all a part of making a wise decision. But over time, I realized something else was happening. The more clarity I gained about who I'm becoming, the easier some of those decisions became. Not because they became simple. There are still trade offs, there are still questions, there are still unknowns, but they became aligned. And I think alignment is one of the most overlooked parts of doctoral preparation. Sometimes we approach graduate school the way we shop for almost anything else. Which one has the best reputation? Which one costs the least? Which one has the most recognizable name? Which one gets me finished the fastest? Again, those aren't bad questions, but I don't think they're complete questions. Because a doctoral program isn't simply something we attend, it's an environment, it's a community, it's a way of thinking. It's a place that will influence how we read, how we write, how we ask questions, how we conduct research, and ultimately how we contribute to the world. That's why identity matters before enrollment. Identity becomes our compass. Without that compass, it's easy to chase what looks impressive instead of what is genuinely aligned with the work we're called to do. And I think that's a distinction that's worth sitting with for a moment. Because the world often rewards what's visible: prestige, recognition, titles, accomplishments. But meaningful scholarship has always been rooted in something much quieter: purpose. I've watched that happen in my own journey. When I first started thinking about graduate school, my focus was pretty straightforward: earn another degree, eventually, earn a doctorate. That was my goal. And honestly, there isn't anything wrong with that goal. Education changes lives, degrees open doors, credentials matter. But somewhere along the way, I noticed the questions I was asking had started changing. But somewhere along the way, I noticed the questions I was asking had started changing. Instead of asking, how do I become Dr. Burns? I found myself asking, what kind of work do I want my life to contribute? What conversations do I want to spend years participating in? What communities do I hope my work will ultimately serve? Those are very different questions. One is centered on achievement, the other is centered on contribution. One asks, what can I earn? The other asks, what can I give? For me, the shift changed almost everything. It changed the books I started reading. It changed the podcasts I was listening to. It changed the conversations I found myself having. It even changed the videos I watched. Recently, I've been spending time watching dissertation proposal defenses and final defenses online. I don't watch them because I'm trying to impress anyone with academic language. I watch them because I'm fascinated by the questions people dedicate years of their lives to answer. And one thing became very clear: no two dissertations are exactly alike. Not because scholars have different levels of intelligence, but because they have different identities, different experiences, different communities, different values, different curiosities, different stories, different questions that simply refuse to leave them alone. I think about that for a moment. Think about that for a moment. Every dissertation begins with a question, but where does that question come from? I don't think it suddenly appears the day someone begins a doctoral program. I think it's been quietly developing for years, maybe even decades. It shaped my childhood, family, faith, community, work, mentors, books, failures, victories, moments of joy, moments of frustration, moments that made me wonder, why is it this way? Could it be different? What if someone looked at this another way? Some questions don't arrive all at once. They grow, they mature, they stay with you. You may put them down for a season, but eventually you find them again. I think that's one of the reasons meaningful research feels so personal. It's rarely about choosing a random topic. It's about finally giving language to questions that have been quietly following you for years. And that's why I don't believe research is ever completely detached from identity. Yes, scholarship requires rigor. Yes, it requires evidence. Yes, it requires intellectual honesty. Those things matter deeply. But we also bring ourselves into the questions we ask. I don't think that's a weakness. I think it's part of what makes scholarship meaningful. For me, I keep returning to the question about Black men, leadership, identity, maintenance, health, community. Not because someone assigned those topics to me, because they're connected to the life that I live. They're connected to the conversations I've had. They're connected to the people I love. They're connected to the experiences that continue to shape the way I see the world. Someone else may spend years studying educational policy, engineering, literature, public health, neuroscience. None of those paths are more valuable than another. They're simply different expressions of who each scholar is becoming. That's why I encourage anyone preparing for doctoral education to spend just as much time understanding themselves as they do understanding universities, research programs, study faculty, compare funding opportunities, learning different methodologies, understanding institutional culture, absolutely. But spend equal time asking yourself questions no university can answer for you. What kind of questions keep finding me? What conversations do I keep returning to? What communities do I care deeply about? What problems make me willing to stay in the conversation long after everyone else has moved on? What kind of contribution do I hope my life will make? Because here's the reality. A doctorate isn't simply about finding answers. It's about committing yourself to questions that matter enough to spend years exploring themselves. And if those questions aren't connected to something deeply rooted inside of you, the journey can begin to feel like you're carrying someone else's purpose instead of your own. Identity doesn't eliminate difficult decisions. It doesn't guarantee you'll always know the right path, but it gives you something to return to whenever every option looks equally attractive on paper. It reminds you why you started. It reminds you who you're becoming. And eventually your questions begin to change. You stop asking, which programs will make me look the most successful? And begin asking, which environments will help me become the scholar I'm called to become? To me, that's a much better question because I think the quality of your doctoral journey will depend less on finding the perfect program and far more on becoming the kind of person who knows why they're there in the first place. One thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is this. If identity matters before enrollment, then what happens after enrollment? Because I don't think the work of becoming stops the day you receive the acceptance letter. If anything, I think that's when a different kind of work begins. The work of protecting who you're becoming. Now, I want to be clear about something. I've never been enrolled in a doctoral program, so I can't speak from that experience. One of the promises I made to myself when I started this podcast was that I would never pretend to have lived an experience that I haven't lived. And that's not what this space is about. But I have listened. I've watched dissertation proposal defenses. I've watched final defenses. I've read books, articles, blogs, and reflections from scholars who have been willing to tell the truth about their journeys, and not just their accomplishment, but the struggles as well. And one thing keeps showing up. The academic work is difficult, but for many people, the emotional work is just as demanding. I've heard people describe feeling isolated, feeling like they were the only person in the room carrying certain experiences, feeling like they constantly had something to prove, feeling like every mistake carried more weight than it should, feeling like they belong intellectually, but they still question whether they belong personally. Those stories stayed with me, not because they make me afraid of pursuing a doctorate, quite the opposite. They remind me that earning a doctorate isn't only an intellectual journey, it's also a deeply human one. And I think that's something we don't always acknowledge. Sometimes we imagine scholarship as something almost mechanical. Read the book, collect the data, analyze the findings, write the paper, defend the dissertation, graduate. But people aren't machines. We don't leave our humanity outside the classroom. We carry it with us. Our families, our communities, our upbringings, our values, our fears, our hopes, our disappointments, our faith, our joy, our grief, our identities walk into every seminar room before we do. And for Black scholars, I think that reality often carries another layer of complexity. Many of us have spent our lives learning how to navigate spaces where we're expected to adapt before we were expected to belong. We learned when to code switch. We learned when to stay quiet. We learned when to explain ourselves. We learned when to anticipate being misunderstood. We learned when our competence might be questioned before our character was ever known. For many of us, those aren't just educational experiences, they're life experiences. That's why I don't think identity is simply something to celebrate. I think it's something to protect. Because there will always be moments inside academia and outside of it when you'll be tempted to believe that fitting in is more important than remaining grounded. There will always be subtle pressures to sound different, write different, think differently. Hide parts of ourselves that don't seem to fit the culture around us. Sometimes those pressures are obvious. Sometimes they're incredibly subtle. Sometimes no one ever tells you to change. You simply begin wondering if you should. And I think that's one of the hardest parts of becoming. Now, let me be equally clear. Every scholar should grow. Every scholar should change. Education should stretch us. Learning should challenge us. Our assumptions should be questioned. Our perspectives should mature. If you're serious about scholarship, we should expect to leave every stage of education seeing the world differently than when we entered it. That's part of becoming. But growth is different from erasure. I think that's one of the most important distinctions I've learned while reflecting on this journey. Growth asks you to expand, erasure asks you to disappear. Growth invites you to think more deeply, erasure convinces you to become someone else. Growth strengthens your voice. Erasure makes you question whether your voice belongs at all. Those are not the same thing. Learning something new should never require abandoning everything that brought you to the classroom in the first place. I don't believe scholarship asks us to erase ourselves. I believe the best scholarship invites us to understand ourselves more deeply. One of the ideas I've come back to over and over while building Becoming Black Scholarly is that our lived experiences are not obstacles to meaningful scholarship. They're often part of what makes our scholarship meaningful. The neighborhoods we grew up in, the conversations around our dinner tables, the churches that shaped us, the schools we attended, the jobs we've worked, the mentors who believed in us, the hardships we've survived, the communities that loved us, the questions we've carried for years. None of those experiences have to disappear because we entered academia. They become part of the perspective we contribute. And I think that's worth protecting. That's one of the reasons I chose the name Becoming Black Scholarly. Not because I believe there's only one way to be a Black scholar. Quite the opposite. There isn't one Black scholarly experience. There isn't one research interest. There isn't one voice. There isn't one path. What I wanted to create was a space that reminds us we don't have to leave our Blackness at the door in order to pursue scholarship. We don't have to leave our humanity behind in order to become intellectually rigorous. We don't have to choose between cultural identity and academic excellence. Those things can exist together. In fact, I think they strengthen one another because scholarship without humanity becomes detached, and humanity without thoughtful reflection struggles to create lasting change. We need both. And maybe that's the reminder someone listening today needs. Your voice doesn't become valuable because an institution recognizes it. Your perspective doesn't become meaningful because someone eventually places doctor in front of your name. Your identity doesn't begin on the first day of orientation. It has been forming through every experience that has brought you to this moment. Protect it, refine it, challenge it, allow it to grow. Be willing to change your mind. Be willing to admit when you're wrong. Be willing to expand your understanding of the world. But don't surrender the person you're becoming simply because you think it will make someone else be more comfortable. Because when your identity is rooted in who you are, you don't have to spend your entire academic journey wondering whether you belong. You already know why you're there. And that confidence has nothing to do with arrogance. It has everything to do with clarity. The clearer you become about who you are, the less likely you are to lose yourself while becoming who you're meant to be. And I can't think of a better form of preparation for doctoral education than that. As we've talked through today's conversation, I keep coming back to the title of this episode, Becoming Before Belonging. Those few words have come to mean something very different to me than they did when I first wrote this down. At first, I thought this episode was going to be about preparing for doctoral education. And in many ways, it is. But the longer I've sat with this idea, the more I've realized it isn't really about doctoral education at all. It's about becoming the kind of person who doesn't need to an institution. But the longer I've sat with this idea, the more I realize that it isn't really about doctoral education at all. It's about becoming the kind of person who doesn't need an institution to tell them who they are. I think about how often we measure our lives by moments of acceptance. The acceptance letter, the job offer, the promotion, the award, the publication, the invitation, the fellowship, the title. Most of us have been taught to believe that those moments change who we are. And to be clear, they matter. You should celebrate every one of them. They represent sacrifices, commitments, long nights, early mornings, faith, persistence. They deserve to be celebrated. But I don't think they're responsible for creating your identity. I think they recognize an identity that has already been taken shape. That's an important difference. Because if we believe acceptance creates identity, then rejection has the power to destroy it. If we believe a title creates our worth, then the absence of that title can make us question our value. I don't want to build my life on something that fragile, and I don't want you to build yours that way either. Because here's what I've come to believe. Belonging isn't permission, it's alignment. The more I've reflected on those words, the more they've challenged me. Real belonging isn't something another person hands to you. It isn't something an institution grants you. It isn't something you receive because someone finally decides you deserve to be in the room. Real belonging is the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're living in alignment with your values, your purpose, and the work you've been called to do. That kind of belonging can be taken away by a rejection letter. It can be diminished by difficult feedback. It can be revoked because someone underestimates your potential, because it was never dependent upon someone else's approval to begin with. And honestly, I think that's one of the greatest gifts identity work can give us. It teaches us to stop looking for permission to become who we've already been growing into. That's why I believe identity work is some of the most important preparation any scholar can do. Long before you build a research agenda, build self awareness. Long before you choose an advisor, understand your values. Long before you learn a methodology, learn what questions refuse to leave you alone. Long before someone introduces you as doctor, become someone whose character is worthy of being heard. Because eventually people will forget your GPA. They'll forget what semester you graduated. They may even forget the title of your dissertation, but they'll remember how you made them think. They'll remember how you treated people. They'll remember the integrity you brought into your work. That's scholarship too. I think we spend too much time asking whether we belong in academic spaces that we sometimes forget to ask another question. What kind of academic space am I hoping to help create? What questions change everything? Because now you're no longer thinking about access, you're thinking about contribution. You're no longer asking, will they accept me? You're asking, what would be different because I was here? To me, that's what scholarship has always been about. Not collecting knowledge for its own sake, not accumulating credentials, not proving how much you know, but contributing something meaningful that didn't exist before we arrived. Maybe that's an idea, maybe it's a framework, maybe it's a research study, maybe it's a classroom, a book. a mentoring relationship. Maybe it's simply creating a space where someone else finally feels seen. Even meaningful contribution begins with someone deciding their voice has something worth offering. In many ways, that's why this podcast exists. I didn't start becoming Black Scholarly because I had all the answers. I started because I had questions. Questions I couldn't stop thinking about. Questions I wish someone had invited me to ask years ago. Questions about identity, purpose, scholarship, legacy, community, and becoming. If you've been listening since episode 1, you've probably noticed that we've spent surprisingly little time talking about application, standardized testing, admissions strategies, or how to write the perfect personal statement. That's intentional. Not because those things aren't important, they are. We'll talk about all of them, but they aren't the foundation. Identity is. Everything else gets built on top of that. Applications come later, programs come later, research comes later, dissertations comes later, titles comes later. The identity comes first. And maybe that's the greatest lesson I'm learning in this season of my own life. I don't have to wait until someone calls me doctor to begin living like a scholar. I can cultivate curiosity today. I can read deeply today. I can ask better questions today. I can write thoughtfully today. I can engage difficult conversations today. I can listen more carefully today. I can challenge my own assumptions today. I can contribute to meaningful conversations today. I can serve my community today. I can mentor someone today. I can continue becoming today. Because when I really think about it, that's what scholars do. Not just after graduation, not just after a dissertation, not just after someone places a hood across their shoulders. Scholars ask questions. Scholars remain curious. Scholars pursue understanding. Scholars contribute. Scholars continue learning. None of those things require permission to begin. Becoming has never been something that starts after acceptance. Becoming is what prepares you for acceptance. And belonging is simply what happens when the person you've been becoming walks into the room. Not looking for permission, not looking for validation, not looking for someone else to tell them what they matter, but ready to contribute, ready to learn, ready to serve, ready to leave the space better than they found it. That's the kind of scholar I hope to become. And if you spent this last hour reflecting with me, I hope it's the kind of scholar you're becoming too. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Any amount of time is a meaningful investment, and I don't take your time or your attention for granted. There are countless podcasts you could have chosen to listen to today, and the fact that you chose to spend your time with me truly means a lot. My hope is that today's conversation doesn't simply give you more information. My hope is that it gives you something to carry with you. Maybe it was a question, maybe it was a new perspective, maybe it was the permission to think differently about your own journey. Or maybe it's simply reminding you that becoming a scholar begins much earlier than most of us have been led to believe. If there's one thing I hope you remember from today's conversation, it's this. Your identity is not something you receive from a university. It's something you cultivate long before you ever walk across the campus. The degree may recognize it, the title may acknowledge it, but neither one creates it. That's work only you can do. And the beautiful thing about that work is that you can begin today. If this conversation resonated with you, I encourage you to share it with another aspiring scholar, especially another Black man who may be navigating this journey in silence. One of the reasons I started becoming Black Scholarly is because I know what it feels like to have questions and not always know where to take them. If this podcast can become that space for someone else, then we're building exactly the kind of community I hope we would build. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you? What challenged you? What questions are you still wrestling with? How has your own understanding of identity changed as you've considered your educational journey? You can email me at becomingblackscholarly@gmail.com. Leave a voicemail or text message at 704-594-1122. Your reflections may become a part of a future conversation because Becoming Black Scholarly isn't just a podcast. It's a conversation, it's a community, and I genuinely believe we become better scholars when we think together. As we continue this journey, we'll spend time talking about doctoral programs, research, writing, faculty relationships, applications, and everything else that comes with preparing for advanced studies. But before we talk about any of those things, I want us to begin here with identity, because I believe identity is the foundation everything else will eventually rest upon. And if you can get that foundation right, the rest of the journey begins to make a little more sense. In our next episode, we will continue to build on that foundation as we explore the next stage of becoming together. Until then, continue reading, continue reflecting, continue asking questions, continue becoming. Because becoming doesn't begin with enrollment. It begins the moment you decide your curiosity is worth pursuing. And if you'd like to continue the conversation between episodes, you can find me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Becoming Black Scholarly. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.